The soldiers refused their orders, not one by one, quietly, in the privacy of conscience, but collectively, visibly, in what observers are now calling the most significant breakdown of military discipline in Benin's modern history. They were told to march toward the northern border. They did not march. They were told to suppress protesters in the streets of Cotonou. They hesitated, and in that hesitation, in that silence where commands once echoed back as action, a political crisis became something far more dangerous for President Patrice Talon and his government. This is not a coup in the conventional sense. There are no tanks rolling through the capital in the early morning hours, no general seizing the national broadcaster to read a prepared statement. What is happening in Benin right now is something more complex, more ideologically charged, and in many ways more consequential than a simple military takeover. It is a crisis of legitimacy, a fracturing of the social and institutional contract between a government and the armed forces sworn to protect it. And at the center of it all is a name that has become something between a symbol and a provocation across West Africa. Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain who seized power in Burkina Faso and has since positioned himself as the ideological standard-bearer of a new Pan-African resistance. To understand what is happening in Cotonou today, you have to understand the fault lines that have been quietly deepening across West Africa for years. The region is in the middle of a profound realignment, one that is simultaneously military, political, and civilizational in its implications. The old architecture of Francafrique, the post-colonial system through which France maintained influence, security partnerships, and economic leverage across its former African territories, is under direct assault. Mali fell first, then Burkina Faso, then Niger. In each case, the script was similar: a military government ejecting French forces, pivoting toward Russia, and wrapping that pivot in the language of sovereignty and dignity. The leaders of these juntas, Assimi Goïta in Mali, Abdourahmane Tiani in Niger, and most visibly Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, have become figures of considerable popular appeal well beyond their own borders. Traoré in particular has cultivated something that no amount of conventional diplomacy can manufacture: genuine street-level legitimacy across West Africa. His speeches, circulated endlessly on social media platforms consumed heavily by young Africans, speak to a generation that did not experience independence as a moment of hope, but inherited its unfulfilled promises. When he speaks of sovereignty, when he invokes the memory of Thomas Sankara, when he frames Western security partnerships as neo-colonial arrangements dressed in the language of counterterrorism, he is not speaking only to Burkinabe citizens. He is speaking to a wider audience that is listening, absorbing, and increasingly organizing around these ideas that Benin's government, under Patrice Talon, made a calculated strategic choice. Talon, a businessman turned president who has governed Benin since 2016 with considerable control over the country's institutions, positioned his government firmly within the Western-aligned camp. His administration maintained strong ties with France, engaged with international financial institutions, and presented Benin as a model of stability and reform in a region defined by chaos. As the Sahel juntas consolidated power and began expelling French forces and ECOWAS-aligned security arrangements, Talon's government took a posture of strategic opposition, supporting, at least tacitly, efforts to isolate the alliance of Sahel states and maintain pressure on the renegade military governments through diplomatic and, allegedly, security channels. This is where the crisis begins. Allegations of foreign military involvement, of Benin's territory being used as a staging ground or corridor for operations directed against or around the Sahel states, have not been officially confirmed. But in the ecosystem of information and rumor that defines West African politics in the social media era, the specific details matter less than the perceived shape of the story. And the story, as understood by a significant portion of Benin's population and apparently by a significant portion of its military, is this: their government has chosen a side in a regional conflict, and that side is not the side of African solidarity. It is the side of external interests. That perception, whether entirely accurate or not, is politically explosive. When demonstrators took to the streets of Cotonou carrying portraits of Ibrahim Traoré, they were not simply expressing support for a foreign leader. They were making a statement about identity, about which direction they believe Benin should face, about whose vision of Africa's future they find more compelling. Traoré's face on a protest sign in Cotonou is a rebuke of everything Talon's government represents: its economic model, its security partnerships, its relationship with France, its positioning within ECOWAS. This is where the stakes become absolutely clear. What looks on the surface like a diplomatic dispute between neighboring governments is actually a battle over the ideological soul of a nation. The military's response to deployment orders is the critical variable here. Armies in West Africa have historically been porous institutions in terms of ideology. Soldiers who share ethnicity, language, family connections, and social networks with populations across borders that were, after all, drawn by European cartographers with minimal regard for the people living within them. The border between Benin and Burkina Faso is a colonial artifact. The communities on either side of it share lineages, languages, and cultural identities that predate the nation-states by centuries. When soldiers in the Beninese army are ordered to prepare for operations that could place them in confrontation with forces from Burkina Faso, with people they may literally consider brothers, the order runs into something deeper than military discipline. It runs into questions of identity, of which loyalties are more fundamental. The Great Refusal, as it has been characterized by observers, is not merely insubordination. It represents a fracturing of the ideological compact between a government and its security apparatus. Militaries function on shared assumptions about the legitimacy of the political authority giving orders. When those assumptions break down, when soldiers begin to question not just the wisdom of an order, but the moral authority of those issuing it, you enter genuinely dangerous territory for any government. Talon's administration appears to be in exactly that territory. This a coordinated refusal, shaped by deliberate organizing within the ranks? Or is it the spontaneous convergence of individually held doubts and sympathies? The distinction matters enormously for what happens next, but from the outside, it is very difficult to determine. What is observable is the outcome: a breakdown in the chain of command that has left the government unable to project force either toward the border or toward its own streets with the reliability it would need to stabilize the situation through conventional means. That Traoré's response to this moment has been notably disciplined in its framing. Rather than issuing statements that sound like military threats or territorial ambitions, which would immediately harden international opinion against him and give ECOWAS and Western governments clean justification for a stronger response, he has wrapped Burkina Faso's posture in the language of sovereignty and Pan-African solidarity. This is strategically intelligent. It positions him not as an aggressor, but as a defender of principles that resonate widely. It makes it harder for external actors to frame the situation as simple regional destabilization and easier for domestic audiences across the region to see him as the protagonist of a legitimate ideological struggle. The ECOWAS dimension to this crisis cannot be overstated. The regional bloc has been under extraordinary strain since the Sahel coups began. Its credibility as an institution capable of enforcing democratic norms and maintaining regional stability has been severely tested. When ECOWAS threatened military intervention against Niger following the July 2023 coup, that threat ultimately did not materialize, undermined by lack of consensus among member states, logistical questions, and the political risk of military action against a popular junta. The alliance of Sahel states formation as an explicit counterblock to ECOWAS represents a direct institutional challenge to the regional order. Benin, as an ECOWAS member state on the geographic front line of this split, finds itself in an almost impossibly difficult position. If Talon's government weakens, if the military's loyalty fractures further, if protests intensify, if his political coalition begins to hedge its bets, the implications for ECOWAS are significant. Benin has been one of the more stable and reliably Western-aligned states in the region. A political collapse there, or even a significant shift in its government's orientation, would represent a substantial expansion of the zone of realignment that has already consumed the Sahel. It would bring the new Pan-African alignment closer to the Atlantic coast, closer to Nigeria, closer to Ghana, closer to the maritime economies that have so far remained more insulated from the wave of anti-Western sentiment sweeping the interior. What happens next could genuinely redefine the region's political geography for a generation. That IT is worth pausing here to examine the role of information and social media in what is unfolding. The protest movement in Cotonou and the apparent sympathies within the military did not emerge from nowhere. They have been shaped and amplified by a media environment in which Pan-Africanist content, often explicitly aligned with the Sahel junta's narratives, circulates with extraordinary speed and reach. Traoré's speeches are subtitled, clipped, shared, and discussed across platforms consumed by West African youth. The framing of events, who is the sovereign defender, who is the proxy collaborator, which government serves its people and which serves external masters, is contested not just in press releases and diplomatic cables, but in millions of individual interactions on smartphones across the region. This is a dimension of modern geopolitics that older analytical frameworks struggle to fully account for. The traditional calculus of state power, military strength, diplomatic relationships, economic leverage still applies. But it operates now within an information environment where popular legitimacy can be built or destroyed at extraordinary speed, and where governments that were once able to control narratives through control of traditional media find themselves outflanked by decentralized digital networks. Talon's government has faced this challenge without an effective counter-narrative. The official framing of his security policies as necessary for Benin's stability has not penetrated with anything approaching the force of the opposition's framing of those same policies as betrayal. The economic dimension of this crisis adds yet another layer of complexity. Benin's port of Cotonou has historically served as a critical trade gateway for landlocked countries in the region, including Burkina Faso and Niger. As the Sahel states have shifted their political alignments and faced Western-aligned economic pressure, the trade relationships that once flowed naturally through Cotonou have become politically complicated. If Benin's government is perceived as hostile to the Sahel states, or if the Sahel states frame it that way, the economic consequences could be significant in both directions. Burkina Faso and Niger have both signaled, with varying degrees of explicitness, that they are developing alternative trade routes and reducing dependence on ports in countries they consider politically adversarial. This matters for Benin's domestic politics because economic grievances and political grievances tend to compound each other. If communities whose livelihoods depend on regional trade feel those livelihoods threatened by government decisions they did not support, political opposition tends to deepen and widen. The protesters in Cotonou are not a monolithic group with a single motivation. They represent a convergence of different frustrations, different visions of national identity, different economic anxieties. Understanding that convergence is essential to understanding why this moment is as volatile as it is. There is also the question of France. French influence in Benin, while less overt than in some of its neighbors, remains a real factor in the country's political economy. Talon's government has maintained close ties with Paris, and those ties have become a target of the same critique that toppled governments in Bamako, Ouagadougou, and Niamey. Whether or not the specific allegations of French military involvement in operations around the northern border are accurate, the perception of French backing for Talon's government feeds directly into the most potent narrative available to the opposition, that Benin is governed not in the interests of Beninese people, but in the interests of external powers. That narrative is a loaded weapon in current West African politics, and it is being deployed with considerable effect. France's strategic position in West Africa has deteriorated dramatically over the past 4 years. Expelled from Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, the network of military partnerships and political relationships that sustained French influence for 6 decades has contracted to a degree that would have been almost unthinkable a decade ago. Benin has been among the countries where France sought to maintain a working relationship as alternatives have closed elsewhere. But that association now carries a political cost that Talon's government may be discovering it cannot afford to absorb indefinitely. The United States, for its part, has watched these developments with a mixture of concern and strategic recalibration. American counterterrorism investments in the Sahel, years of training, equipping, and partnering with regional security forces, produced limited results against jihadist insurgencies and then watched as the governments that hosted those partnerships were overturned. American policy in the region has not found a clear new framework for engaging with the post-coup governments or managing the drift toward Russia. The situation in Benin adds another data point to a picture that American strategic planners are still struggling to interpret coherently. Russia's involvement in the region, primarily through the Wagner Group, now rebranded and restructured, but operationally continuous, is the variable that Western governments are watching most carefully. The Sahel junta's pivot toward Russia has brought Russian military advisors and contractors into Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Whether Russian influence is actively stoking the crisis in Benin, whether Traoré is acting with Russian encouragement or independently on the basis of his own ideological convictions and strategic calculations, is a question that current available information does not definitively answer. What is clear is that the crisis serves Russian strategic interests in the region. It extends the zone of uncertainty, strains a Western-aligned government, and demonstrates the apparent appeal of the anti-Western Pan-Africanist narrative in yet another country. The question of what Traoré himself wants from this moment is genuinely complex. He has framed Burkina Faso's posture carefully, avoiding explicit statements that would constitute overt interference in a neighboring state's internal affairs. But the political effect of his presence in this crisis, the way his image circulates through Beninese protests, the way his rhetoric provides the ideological vocabulary for opposition to Talon's government, means that he is a significant actor in what is unfolding, whether or not he is directly orchestrating it. There is a meaningful distinction between leading a destabilization campaign and being an inspiration for one. Both can produce similarly disruptive results. For Talon, the options available are narrowing. The conventional tools of political management, security deployment, media control, economic pressure require a functional and loyal security apparatus. The reports of military hesitation and refusal suggest that apparatus is under stress in ways that may not be quickly reversible. Political concessions to the opposition risk being read as weakness that invites further pressure. A crackdown that produces casualties could trigger the very dynamic his government most fears: mass outrage, further military defections, and international condemnation that isolates him while his domestic position weakens. Regional diplomatic intervention, through ECOWAS or bilaterally from Nigeria or Ghana, is a theoretical possibility, but the bloc's credibility and cohesion have been strained to the point where its ability to intervene effectively in a member state's internal crisis is genuinely uncertain. Nigeria, ECOWAS's largest power, has its own internal challenges and has historically been reluctant to commit significant political capital to interventions that don't carry clear strategic benefits. The scenario that most concerns regional analysts is one in which the crisis in Benin is neither resolved cleanly nor escalates into open conflict, but instead settles into a prolonged period of institutional dysfunction, declining state authority, and expanding ungoverned space. That is the pattern that preceded the security collapses in the Sahel, and those collapses created the conditions in which jihadist insurgencies expanded dramatically. Benin's northern regions, bordering Burkina Faso, have already experienced an uptick in jihadist activity in recent years. A government distracted by political survival, a military with fractured loyalties, and a state unable to project consistent authority northward creates conditions that armed non-state actors know how to exploit. This is the larger strategic picture that makes what is happening in Cotonou streets and barracks significant far beyond Benin's borders. If Benin's stability deteriorates, if the country tilts toward the political alignment of the Sahel states, or even if it simply becomes too internally distracted to maintain the security commitments it has made to partners, the ripple effects extend south and east toward countries that have so far managed to remain outside the direct zone of disruption. The prospect of the instability corridor reaching the Gulf of Guinea coast, connecting the landlocked Sahel crisis to the maritime economies that are the most economically significant zone of the region, is the scenario that Western governments, regional organizations, and major trading partners have been working to prevent. The protesters carrying Traoré's portrait in Cotonou may not be thinking in those terms. Their grievances are immediate, personal, national, about who governs them, in whose interests, with what vision. but the forces that their protest intersects with are geopolitical in scale and consequence. The collision between those individual, nationally rooted grievances and the larger regional and global forces moving through this moment is what gives the crisis in Benin its particular weight and urgency. What happens in Benin in the coming weeks and months will serve as a test of several things simultaneously. It will test whether a government in the ECOWAS zone can survive the ideological and political pressure that has already toppled 4 of its neighbors. It will test whether the Pan-Africanist anti-Western narrative driving those political changes has genuinely spread beyond the Sahel, or whether the Sahel cases were specific to particular conditions that Benin's somewhat different history and political culture can contain. It will test whether ECOWAS retains any meaningful capacity to support member states under internal pressure, or whether its institutional authority has been hollowed out beyond repair. And it will test whether the military loyalty that all governments ultimately depend on can be sustained when soldiers are asked to act against a movement that frames itself and is widely perceived not as a threat to Benin, but as an expression of a deeper African identity. None of these tests have obvious outcomes. The situation is genuinely fluid in ways that make confident predictions irresponsible. What is clear is that this is not a routine political crisis. The specific combination of factors at work in Benin right now, the military refusal, the popular protest, the presence of Traoré as an ideological catalyst, the allegations of foreign involvement, the fracturing of institutional loyalty, represents a genuinely novel configuration of pressures that does not map neatly onto historical precedents. The Africa that produced the coups in the Sahel is not the same Africa that existed a generation ago. It is more connected, more politically conscious, more driven by a generation that did not grow up with Cold War frameworks and does not view the world through the lens of choosing between Soviet and American camps. The current generation chooses between different visions of African futures, and increasingly, significant portions of it are choosing visions that reject the institutional arrangements that post-independence African states were built within. That is a structural force, not simply a political fashion, and it will shape the continent's politics for years regardless of how any individual crisis resolves. Benin stands at the intersection of all of this. A small country on the Gulf of Guinea, not historically the most geopolitically prominent state in the region, has suddenly become the place where several of the most consequential questions about West Africa's future are being contested simultaneously. What Patrice Talon does in the next critical period, what Benin's military decides its loyalty actually means, what the street movements consolidate around, and whether external actors choose to engage constructively or exploit the situation for narrower interests. All of these will shape an outcome whose consequences will extend well beyond Cotonou's boundaries. The question is no longer simply whether Talon's government survives. The question is what kind of Benin emerges from this moment, and what its emergence means for the region still trying to find its footing in one of the most turbulent political periods in West Africa's post-independence history. That question does not yet have an answer, but the world, or at least the part of it paying close attention to what is actually happening in Africa, is watching for one.